The war is over. The gates are open. And they will not leave. It is 1946. Somewhere in the English countryside, a ship's horn sounds across gray water a low, mournful note that carries for miles. That ship has come for them. It has come to take them home. Back to Germany. Back to the language of their mothers. Back to whatever is left standing. And across the camp, behind a fence that no longer has the strength to hold anyone, thousands of German soldiers hear that horn. And do not move. These are prisoners of war. Enemy soldiers. Men who, a few short years ago, marched across Europe with rifles on their backs and orders to conquer. The country they are standing in is the country that beat them. It bombed their cities. It buried their friends. By every law of hatred ever written, this cold island should be the last place on earth any of them would ever want to stay. And yet, when the moment finally comes to go home, around 24,000 of them will choose Britain instead. Not one. Not a handful. 24,000 men will turn their backs on their own homeland and stay in the country of their enemy for the rest of their lives. Why? What happens inside these camps and inside these men to break something that generations of war had welded shut? How does a defeated soldier come to look at the enemy's fields, the enemy's towns, the enemy's kitchen table, and call it home? This is the story they never taught you. The story of how Britain won one of the strangest victories of the entire war without firing a single shot. No tanks. No bombers. No last heroic charge. Just a plate of food, handed across a kitchen table, to a man who was supposed to be the enemy. This is the story of the day German prisoners discovered British hospitality and never wanted to leave. To understand why staying was unthinkable, you have to understand exactly where these men were standing. Because in 1946, Britain was not a soft place. It was a wound. By the autumn of that year, there were more than 400,000 German prisoners of war on British soil. 400,000. Stop and picture that number. An entire army larger than most nations could put in the field, living behind wire, in hundreds of camps scattered from the Scottish borders down to the southern coast. And here is the strange part. Most of them hadn't even been captured in Britain. They had been shipped in from America and Canada after the fighting stopped, herded back across the Atlantic to a small, exhausted island that was still counting its own dead. Their world was Nissen huts and mud. Curved sheets of corrugated iron over a concrete floor, a stove in the middle that never quite beat the cold. Roll call in the gray dawn, the same faces, the same fences, the same gray sky pressing down day after day. And the letters that came slowly, or came with terrible news, or did not come at all. Because make no mistake, Britain was in no mood for mercy. This was a country that had spent years living under the bombs. Night after night the sirens had wailed and the sky had filled with the drone of engines. Mothers had dragged their children down into shelters in the dark. Whole streets had simply ceased to exist by morning, a family home reduced to a smoking gap in a terrace, as though a tooth had been knocked from a jaw. Everyone had lost someone. A brother, a father, a son who went off to fight and never came back through the door. And then, in April 1945, came the thing that turned grief into something colder and harder. British soldiers pushed into northern Germany and opened the gates of a place called Bergen-Belsen. What they found there does not need to be described in detail. The film reels went around the world, and the world has never been able to forget them. The living who were barely alive. The dead in their thousands. A horror on a scale no ordinary person had imagined a human being could do to another. After Belsen, the word German changed its meaning. It stopped being simply the name of an enemy soldier. It became the name of that. And every one of these prisoners now carried that shadow across his shoulders, whether he had ever been anywhere near those places or not. So the rules were cold, and they were simple. There was an official ban on fraternization. Ordinary British people were forbidden from any friendly contact with German prisoners at all. No conversations across the fence. No small kindnesses. No inviting a shivering man in from the rain. The barbed wire around the camps was only the fence you could see. The real fence ran straight through every British heart, and it was built out of memory and loss. And not every prisoner was treated the same, because not every prisoner was trusted the same. As the men arrived, they were screened and sorted by how deeply the British believed the ideology had taken root in them. The committed and the fanatical were held apart from the ordinary conscripts, the farm boys and factory workers, who had simply been swept up in something far larger and darker than themselves. Some camps became places of quiet re-education, where lectures and discussions and carefully chosen newspapers were used to try, slowly, to loosen the grip of years of propaganda. The war on the battlefield was over, but a stranger, subtler war, a war for the minds of these men, had only just begun, and no one yet knew who would win it. And here is the true cruelty at the center of it all, the thing that made this a trap, and not just a punishment. Home was no escape either. Because what, exactly, was waiting for these men across the sea? Germany was rubble. Its great cities had been pounded flat, mile after mile of broken brick where streets used to be, families living down in cellars, children picking through the ruins for anything at all. And for the men who came from the east of the country, it was worse still. Their towns, their farms, the church where they were married, the graves of their parents, all of it now sat behind a brand new border, under Soviet control. Many of them had no home left to return to at all, no house, no village, and in far too many cases, no way of even knowing whether their families were still alive. So picture the trap these men were caught in. Turn around, and behind them stood a country that had every reason on earth to hate them. Look ahead, and there was a homeland that had been beaten into ash and ghosts. Prisoners in the truest sense of the word, not just of the wire, but of history itself. This was the grinding problem. And there was no obvious way out of it. But wars end. And life is stubborn. It grows back through the cracks in the concrete, whether you want it to or not. Post-war Britain had a problem of its own, a very practical one. It was worn out, and it was desperately short of men. The fields still needed working. The harvest still had to be brought in before it rotted. A shattered country had to be dug out and rebuilt, and there simply weren't enough hands left to do it. So the prisoners were put to work. Every day, tens of thousands of them were sent out from the camps onto farms, into fields, down the quiet lanes of rural Britain to labor side by side with the very people who were supposed to hate them. And there were a great many of them out there. In those lean, hungry post-war years, German prisoners became one of the single largest sources of labor the British countryside had. They dug, and they planted, and they harvested. They cleared the land, and worked the animals, and repaired what the war years had let fall into ruin. In some places, at some times, it was prisoner hands that brought the harvest home and helped keep a rationed nation fed. These men were not a rumor behind a distant fence anymore. They were there, every single day, in the next field, over close enough to catch your eye, close enough to nod to. And proximity, it turns out, is a very dangerous thing to hatred. And so something no government had planned for began, quietly, to happen. Out in a field, hour after hour, day after day, the word enemy starts to lose its shape. Because you cannot dig a ditch beside a man for a week and keep him an abstraction. You cannot stack hay with him and share the ache in your back at the end of it and still see a monster. Slowly, without anyone deciding it, the German becomes this German. The one who is good with the horses. The one who mends a fence properly and takes pride in it. The one who, at the end of a long day, quietly reaches inside his coat and takes out a creased photograph and shows you the faces of his own children, and you feel a strange jolt, because you realize he is frightened for them in exactly the way you would be frightened for yours. The farmers noticed something they hadn't expected. These men were hard workers, uncomplaining, skilled, many of them. And the families who watched them come and go began to notice something even more unsettling to a heart full of grief, that these were, in the end, just men. Tired, homesick, ordinary men, a very long way from everything and everyone they loved. And out of those hundreds of thousands of prisoners, one man in particular would come to stand for the whole strange story. His name was Bernhard Trautmann. In time, the British would come to know him and love him as Bert. Now, Trautmann was not a gentle figure to begin with. Understand that clearly. He was a paratrooper, a Fallschirmjäger, a member of the elite of the German war machine. He had fought on the brutal Eastern Front and had been decorated for it, including with the Iron Cross. On paper, he was precisely the kind of hardened, dangerous enemy soldier the British public pictured in their darkest nightmares. Captured near the very end of the war, he ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Lancashire, in the industrial north of England. By every reasonable expectation, his story should have ended right there. Repatriated with all the rest, loaded onto a ship, sent back across the sea, forgotten by history within a year. Instead, when the war ended, Bert Trautmann chose to stay. He took work on the land, like so many of the others. But Trautmann had something that could not be caged. He could keep goal. On rough, makeshift pitches he threw himself around like a man possessed, and people began to talk. Before long he was turning out for a local non-league side, St. Helens Town. And here is the extraordinary thing: the crowds who first came to jeer the German ended up staying to watch him. Because whatever they thought of his uniform, what he was doing between those two posts was simply impossible to ignore. A German paratrooper, a prisoner of war, standing in an English goalmouth, in front of an English crowd, doing something they could not help but admire. The maverick had arrived, and he was about to become the living, breathing proof of everything this story is about. Now comes the turn that no one saw coming. The moment the entire story tilts on its axis and starts to move in a direction that should have been impossible. Because the country that had every reason in the world to hate these men began, instead, to open its front doors to them. In December 1946, the British government did something quietly astonishing. It relaxed the ban on fraternization. For the first time since the war, German prisoners were permitted to be invited into British homes. And at Christmas, the Christmas of 1946, thousands of them were. Stop, and let the sheer strangeness of that settle over you. It is deep winter. The war is barely over, the rubble is still smoking, the graves are still fresh. And in towns and villages across Britain, in houses where a photograph of a lost son still sits in silence on the mantelpiece, ordinary families set an extra place at the table for a German soldier. Picture the scene. A prisoner who, just 12 months earlier, had been the enemy, the faceless abstraction behind the falling bombs, now sitting in a warm English kitchen. The windows fogged with steam, the smell of Christmas dinner filling the room, children peering wide-eyed at the strange man with the accent and the sad eyes, and a mother, a woman who may well have lost her own boy to men wearing that same uniform, leaning across the table, and, without a word, simply handing him a plate. There is no arithmetic in the world that explains that plate. No treaty made it happen. No general gave the order. It came from somewhere older and deeper and far stranger than politics, from that stubborn, baffling, magnificent human instinct that looks at a lonely man out in the cold and, against every reasonable argument, decides to bring him inside. And for men who had spent years being nothing but a number, nothing but an enemy, nothing but a uniform behind a fence, that warmth landed like a physical blow to the chest. Many of them had not sat at a family table in years. Some had not been shown a moment's tenderness since before the war began. There were men who would remember that single Christmas dinner, and the kindness of strangers who owed them nothing, for the rest of their lives. And once that door was open, it did not swing shut again. The friendships deepened. The prisoners kept coming back to help bring in the harvest, to share a meal, to sit by the fire on a Sunday. And where there are warm kitchens and young people and shared work, there is, sooner or later, something more than friendship. From 1947, the rules were relaxed again, this time to allow marriages between German prisoners and British women. And they came. Men who had first set foot on this island as enemies began to fall in love with the daughters of the very country that had defeated them. A shared walk home in the dark became something. Something became an engagement. An engagement became a family, and a future, and a reason to stay. And these were not small numbers, nor passing flings. All across the country, in quiet register offices and village chapels, the same impossible thing kept happening: a former enemy and a local woman, standing side by side, beginning a life together. Each marriage was a small, private treaty that no diplomat had ever sat down to negotiate. Each one drove another nail into the coffin of the idea that these men were, and would always be, simply the enemy. The war had ended on paper in 1945, with signatures and surrenders. But in these kitchens, and at these altars, it was ending for real: one household, one wedding ring, one shared future at a time. The barbed wire was still standing. But with every shared meal, every mended fence, every evening by the fire, it meant less and less. It was quietly becoming just a fence. And this is the secret at the very heart of the whole story, a secret so simple it is almost impossible to believe. Britain did not win these men over with force. Every weapon in the world had already been used against them, and every one of them had failed. What finally reached them, what finally cracked open a heart hardened by years of war, was the exact opposite of a weapon. It was a table, a fire, a plate handed across a kitchen. It was hospitality, and it did what no army on earth could ever do. It turned enemies into neighbors. But do not, for one moment, mistake this for a simple fairy tale, because for these men, the kindness itself carried a weight that was almost impossible to bear. Think truly about what it means to be shown gentleness by the very people you were sent to destroy. Every prisoner in those camps knew by now what had been done in Germany's name. The newsreels had made absolutely certain of that. They had seen or been made to see the images from Belsen and the other camps. They carried that knowledge inside their chests like a cold stone that would not warm. And now here they were, being fed at the tables of the people their nation had bombed, being treated with a tenderness that a part of them was not at all sure they had any right to receive. That is its own kind of torment. To be forgiven before you have even found the words to ask for it. To be handed warmth when a voice inside you insists you have earned nothing but the cold. And beneath that weight, a second one was steadily growing, because a decision was coming for every single one of them. One choice, with no good answer on either side of it. Repatriation was on its way. Sooner or later that ship's horn would sound for real, and every man would have to decide, once and for all, go or stay. Go home. The word itself pulls at something no man alive can argue against. Home is your mother's voice calling you in as a boy. It is the language you dreamed in before you knew any other. It is the smell of your own village on a summer evening. The exact shape of the hills you grew up beneath. The churchyard where your father and his father before him lie buried. Every instinct a man has ever had says the same thing. Go home. Whatever is left of it, go. But then, always, the other voice. Home to what? Home to a heap of rubble where your street used to stand. To a country carved down the middle. Half of it now sealed behind a Soviet wall you might never be permitted to cross again. To a family you cannot find, or worse still, to a family you already know in your heart you will not find. For a great many of these men, home had become a word that no longer pointed at anything that still existed in the world. And Britain? Britain was the enemy. Britain had beaten them, and caged them, and put them to work in its fields. But Britain was also the farmer who clapped him on the shoulder and called him a good man. The kitchen that smelled of Christmas. The girl whose laugh he had started, without meaning to listen for. The steady work that made him feel for the first time in years like a man again, and not a number stenciled on a hut. Now imagine lying awake in a freezing barracks, with that war raging inside your own skull. Blood and language and memory dragging you one way. Warmth and safety and the faint, fragile, barely dared to hope shape of a future dragging you the other. Somewhere out beyond the wire. A ship, waiting, and perhaps folded in your pocket. A letter you have written home a dozen times over and never once had anywhere to send. This was the real battlefield of the entire story. Not a field in France. Not a beach, or a bridge, or a burning city. It was a quiet, sleepless private argument being fought inside the heart of every prisoner who had, without ever once intending to, started to belong. And then, the choosing came, and it broke the world clean in two. By 1948, the Great Repatriation was complete. The camps emptied out. Ship after ship after ship carried the prisoners back across the sea to Germany, the vast majority of them, hundreds of thousands of men, going home at last to find out what that word even meant anymore. For some of them, there was a reunion waiting, a door opening, a face they had prayed for through 1,000 cold nights, still there, still alive. A miracle in a ruined country. For too many others, there was only silence. A town that was no longer there. A street reduced to a memory. A family that could not be found, no matter how they searched. They had crossed an entire sea to reach home and discovered, the moment they arrived, that home had died quietly while they were away. That is one side of the contrast. And it is heavy enough to break a person. The other side is the 24,000 who stayed. They did not sail. When the horn sounded for them, they let it go, and they watched the ships leave without them. They stayed for the marriages they had made, and the children now on the way, and the work, and the fields, and the warmth, and, for so many of the men from the East, quite simply because there was nowhere else left on this earth for them to go. But do not imagine, even for a moment, that staying was the easy road. The fence in people's hearts did not come down overnight. The suspicion did not simply vanish. And no story shows that harder truth better than the man we last saw keeping goal in the north of England. Because in 1949, Manchester City, a great club, in one of England's great cities, signed Bert Trautmann, a German, a former paratrooper, a prisoner of war, in goal, for their team. And the city erupted. Thousands of people protested, by some accounts as many as 20,000. There were angry demonstrations. There were petitions. And a great deal of that fury came from Manchester's Jewish community, for whom the sight of a German ex-paratrooper pulling on the club's shirt was not sport at all. It was a wound, and a fresh one. This was only a handful of years after the camps. The pain was not history yet. It was still now. It was still raw. It could have ended his career before it had even begun. It could, very easily, have ended in something far worse. And then came an act of extraordinary grace, from the last place anyone might have expected it. From a rabbi. Dr. Alexander Altman, a leading rabbi in Manchester, a man who had every personal and communal reason in the world to stand shoulder to shoulder with the protesters, instead stood up and spoke against the tide. He urged people not to condemn a man for the nation he happened to be born into. He asked them to judge Trautmann not by his old uniform, not by his birthplace, but by his own conduct. As a man, here and now. Coming from him of all people, those words carried a force that nothing else on earth could have matched. And slowly, grudgingly, unevenly, the city began to come round. And then Bert Trautmann settled the entire argument himself, in the most astonishing way imaginable. It was the 1956 FA Cup final. Wembley Stadium. In front of a watching nation. Manchester City against Birmingham City. Late in the match, with the game still to be won, Trautmann threw himself headlong at the feet of an onrushing forward and took a sickening blow to the neck. He was knocked half senseless. But there were no substitutes in football in those days. If the goalkeeper went off, his team would have to finish the match a man short. And so Bert Trautmann dragged himself up off the Wembley turf and kept playing. For the last agonizing minutes of that final, he threw his body around his goal, making save after save, his head held at a strange and unnatural angle, in obvious and terrible pain. And City held on. They won, 3-1. 3 days later, an X-ray revealed the truth of what he had done. Trautmann had played the closing stretch of an FA Cup final diving, catching, colliding with grown men with a broken neck. The bones in his neck were dislocated. One of them had cracked clean through. By the width of a fraction of an inch, it had not killed him where he stood. And that same season, this German, this former enemy, This prisoner of war was voted Footballer of the Year, the first foreign player ever to receive that honor in England. There it is, the tragedy and the triumph, standing side by side. Hundreds of thousands of men going home to ruins and silence. Families divided forever by a single choice made a offense. And one prisoner of war, carried shoulder high through the streets of an English city as a hero, by the very same people who, a few short years before, had gathered in their thousands to keep him out. So let us go back now, to where we began, to that cold morning in 1946, to the open gate and the waiting ship and the man behind the wire who hears the horn and does not move. We can finally answer the question we started with. Why did they refuse to leave? Because somewhere between the barbed wire and the Christmas table, something had quietly, impossibly changed. Somewhere between a mended fence and a plate handed across a warm kitchen, the enemy had turned into the neighbor. And the neighbor, in the end, had turned into home. Those 24,000 men who stayed did not remain prisoners. They became something no one on either side of the war could have predicted. They became British. They married. They raised children who grew up speaking with local accents. They opened shops on ordinary high streets and worked the same land they had first been marched out to as captives, and grew old in towns that slowly stopped thinking of them as German at all. Their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren walk the streets of Britain today, woven so completely into the fabric of the country that most of them will never know their family's story began behind a fence, with a ship they chose not to board. Think of that the next time you pass an ordinary house on an ordinary street. Behind some of those doors, the family line runs back not to a village a few miles away, but to a prison camp, and a war, and a young man who once wore the enemy's uniform and was handed a plate of food he never forgot. They did not conquer this country, as they were once sent to do. In the end, they were simply absorbed by it. Quietly, completely, for good. And Bert Trautmann became the symbol of all of it. The German paratrooper the British public had been taught to fear, who ended his days as one of the most beloved figures Manchester has ever known. A prisoner of war who won a nation's respect not with words, but by throwing his own body between the ball and the goal, until his neck broke, and refusing, even then, to leave his post. He lived a long, full life, and he died in 2013, mourned in the country of his birth, and the country that had once been his enemy alike. Because here, in the end, is the real meaning of the story, and it is important to be honest about it. This was never a tale of Britain being soft. It did not begin with open arms. It began with suspicion and barbed wire, and the long black shadow of Belsen falling across every one of these men. The hatred was real, and it was earned, and it did not melt away by magic. What changed everything was not a grand policy, or a signed agreement, or a speech from a great leader. It was smaller than all of that, and far more powerful. It was an extra place laid at a table on Christmas Day. It was a fence mended together in a muddy field. It was a plate, a single warm plate, handed from one human being to another, across a kitchen, in the depth of winter. That was the weapon that finally won. Not the bomb, not the rifle, the open door. The war took years, and countless lives, and the very best that armies could throw at one another. And in the end, the thing that reached these men, the thing that beat the enemy for good, was the one thing no war had ever thought to try. Simple, ordinary, human kindness. That is why they refused to leave. Because when that ship's horn sounded across the gray water, and every instinct told them to go home, they looked around at the country that had defeated them, and the people who had, against all reason, taken them in, and realized they were already there.